Fall is a Latin word originally meaning sickle but was later used to mean any of a number of tools that had a curved blade that was sharp on the inside edge such as a scythe. Fall was also used to mean a weapon particularly that of the Thracians and Dacians and, later, a siege hook used by the Romans themselves. Dacian fall. In Latin texts, the weapon was described as an ensis falcatus by Ovid in Metamorphoses and as a fall supina by Juvenal in Satirae. The Dacian fall came in two sizes, one-handed and two-handed. The shorter variant was called sica in the Dacian language with a blade length that varied but was usually around 16 inches long with a handle 1/3 longer than the blade. The two-handed fall was a pole arm. It consisted of a 3 feet long wooden shaft with a long curved iron blade of nearly equal length attached to the end. Archaeological evidence indicates that the one-handed fall was also used two-handed. The blade was sharpened only on the inside and was reputed to be devastatingly effective. However, it left its user vulnerable because, being a two-handed weapon, the warrior could not also make use of a shield. It may be imagined that the length of the two-handed fall allowed it to be wielded with great force, the point-piercing helmets and the blade-splitting shields. It was said to be capable of splitting a shield in two at a single blow. Alternatively, it might be used as a hook, pulling away shields and cutting at vulnerable limbs, or striking the edge of a strong shield. The inward curving point was still able to pierce the armor or flesh of the target behind the shield, rendering even the most reinforced shields much less effective defensively against a fall wielder. Trajan's column is a monument to the Emperor unregistered trademark S conquest of Dacia. The massive base is covered with reliefs of trophies of Dacian weapons and includes several illustrations of the two-handed fall. The column itself has a helical frieze that tells the story of the Dacian wars. On the frieze, almost all the Dacians that are armed have shields and therefore cannot be using a two-handed fall. Unfortunately, the exact weapon of those few shown without shields cannot be determined with certainty. The frieze of Trajan's column also shows Dacians using a smaller, sword-sized fall. However, this column is also largely stylized, with the sculptor believed to have worked from Trajan's now-lost commentary and unlikely to have witnessed the events himself. A further problem is that most of the weapons on the monument were made of metal, which have since disappeared. The Adamclisi monument, built by Trajan to commemorate the Romans who lost their lives in the Dacian counterattack in Musia, is thought to have been constructed by the soldiers who fought there, so it may be more accurate. This column shows 4 distinct types of fall, whereas Trajan's shows only one type that does not resemble any on the Adamclisi monument. Because of this, historians disagree on which depiction is correct, but has been pointed out that if the Trajan's column fall is correct, then there would have been no need to modify Roman armor. Both columns show the Dacians fighting with no armor apart from a shield, although some on the Adamclisi are wearing helmets. Some historians believe that armor was not depicted to differentiate Dacians from Romans, as both used the same style shield. Other sources indicate that Dacians by this time had undergone Romanization, used Roman military tactics, and sometimes wore Roman-style scale armor. It is likely that the nobles at least wore armor and, combined with the fall, the Dacians would have been a formidable threat. Effectiveness equals. At the time of the Dacian Wars, researchers have estimated that only 10% of Spanish and Gallic warriors had access to swords, usually the nobility. By contrast, Dacia had rich resources of iron and were prolific metal workers. It is clear that a large percentage of Dacians owned swords, greatly reducing Rome's military advantage. Marcus Cornelius Fronto described the large gaping wounds that a fall inflicted, and experiments have shown that a blow from a fall easily penetrated the Romans' lorica segmentata, incapacitating the majority of victims. These experiments also show that the fall was most efficient when targeting the head, shoulder, leg and especially the right arm, which was generally exposed. A legionary who had lost the use of his right arm became a serious liability to his unit in battle. The time of the conquest of Dacia by Trajan is the only known instance of the Roman army adapting personal equipment while on campaign, and it seems likely that this was a response to this deadly weapon. Roman legionaries had transverse reinforcing iron straps applied to their helmets, it is clear that these are late modifications because they are roughly applied across existing embossed decoration. The legions also reintroduced the wearing of lorica hemata and lorica squamata for the Dacia campaign, as both were more flexible than the newer segmentata armor and were able to distribute damage more widely. In addition, both these older armor styles had unique modifications. A row of tirages was added to the sleeves, a double row of tirages was added to the skirt, and a heavily padded vestment was worn underneath them. Roman armor of the time left limbs unprotected. Trajan introduced the use of greaves and an arm protector for the right arm, which had previously been used only by gladiators, and which was never used again by soldiers once the Dacia campaign concluded. Thracian fall. The Thracians also made use of the fall. They also used the Rhone fire, a weapon very similar to the two-handed fall but much less drastically curved. Development. The two-handed fall is clearly related to the Thracian Rhone fire. It is a derivative of both the sword and the spear, having evolved from a spear to a polearm before becoming more dramatically curved to facilitate a superior cutting action. This drastic curve rendered the fall a purely offensive weapon to be used against a broken or routing force. Typically, an enemy would be broken by a sustained hail of missile fire from javelin, dart, bow, sling, and stone-throwing troops before being chased down and cut to pieces by the fall wielders. The ancestor of the two-handed fall may have been a farming implement used as an improvised weapon, in a manner analogous to the bilge's arm. The single-handed fall might have been inspired by the sickle, although agricultural sickles of the time were typically quite small, no more than 30 centimeters or so in length. At the time of the Dacian Wars, producing a long, sharp blade was technically challenging. As such, it might be that the larger two-handed fall was a high-status weapon and used only by the best warriors. Gallery. See also, Dacian warfare, Rhone fire, scythe sword, siege hook, sickle sword, bill, defalcation. References. External links, Barangic Cian Kursayunin Arsenal Alarm Ela Kirby Tricis. Foldasica. C. Bus, I, 2009. Demonstration of a reconstructed fall in use. The curved sword of the Dacians. Fall as a tool. Dacian wielding single-handed fall, Trajan's column. Dacians wielding single-handed phalanx, Trajan's column. Images of historical reenactor with fall. Trajan's column, besieged Dacians sally forth.